Welcome to Monetary Policy by Sophia Frixell and Eileen Weisner. All right, so what is monetary policy? So, just like the government uses fiscal policy to influence the U.S. economy, the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy to influence the U.S. economy. Monetary policy focuses on altering the money supply in order to either stimulate or slow down the economy. Monetary policy that stimulates the economy is expansionary. During expansionary monetary policy, real interest rates will go down. Monetary policy that slows the economy is contractionary. During contractionary monetary policy, real interest rates will go up. So, why do these interest rates matter? Well, the interest rate will dictate how much investing will happen. And this impacts the economy because, as you may remember, the equation for aggregate demand includes investment. The lower the interest rate is, the cheaper it is to invest, thus more people will be compelled to invest, which altogether raises aggregate demand. If an economy is in a recession, lowering the interest rate can create an economic boost sufficient to close that gap. And the same thing goes the other way around. The higher the interest rate is, the more expensive it is to invest, thus people will be less compelled to invest, which lowers aggregate demand. If an economy is facing inflation, raising the interest rate can cool down the economy sufficient to curb inflation. So, what does the Fed have to enact monetary policy? Well, the Federal Reserve has three main tools in its little Fed toolbox to enact monetary policy. Each tool ranges in convenience and effectiveness. So, number one, perhaps the most important one, we have open market operations. So these open market operations consist of buying and selling treasury bonds. But first, we're going to have a little bonds side tangent. So what are treasury bonds? Treasury bonds are like loans one makes to the government. Say New Rochelle wanted to build a new stadium. It needs funds to build this stadium, so it issues bonds. Mr. Gurney buys a bond for $30,000. Each bond has a set amount of time until it matures and a coupon rate that dictates the amount of money the buyer, in this case Mr. Gurney, will receive in interest. Anyways, the New Rochelle government uses Gurney's $30K to build the stadium. Once completed, the stadium that New Rochelle built will generate income which will then be used to pay back Mr. Gurney. Each year, the government pays Mr. Gurney interest payments based on a set interest rate, which we established was the coupon rate. This coupon rate is set in stone when you buy the bond and will not change. Say Mr. Gurney's bond matures in 10 years at a coupon rate of 5%. That means that for the next 10 years, the New Rochelle government will pay Mr. Gurney a payment of $15,000 because that's 5% of $30,000. At the end of the 10 years, the bond reaches maturity and the government of New Rochelle pays back the full $30,000 that Gurney initially borrowed. So now Mr. Gurney has the $30,000 plus the 10 interest payments of $1.5K. Good investment. All right, so now that we know that, bonds can be bought and sold on prices that depend on the interest rate. You must remember this. Bond prices are inversely related to interest rates. If interest rates are low, then bond prices will be high. So if interest rates are high, bond prices are low. Why? Well, this is a simplified explanation, but if you buy a bond for a coupon rate of 5% and then the interest rate rises to 10%, then you must sell your bond for cheaper in order to make it competitive to the bonds that yield higher interest payments. All right. Anyways, if the Fed buys bonds, it is putting money into the hands of the people to spend, which stimulates the economy. Because, if the government sells bonds, it takes money from the people, and that will slow the economy. All right. So anyways, a good mnemonic device to remember this is buy bonds, bigger bucks, and sell bonds, smaller bucks. Anyways, moving on, the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate at which commercial banks pay for borrowing from the Fed. Meanwhile, the federal funds rate is the interest rate which commercial banks pay for borrowing with each other for like overnight transactions. The discount rate is always higher than the federal funds rate. If the Fed lowers the discount rate, then the federal funds rate will also have to decrease in order to stay competitive in relation to the discount rate. A lower federal funds rate will lower the real interest rate, which spurs the economy by, as we said earlier, making investing cheaper. Raising the discount rate will have the opposite effect. Federal funds rate and interest rates will increase and slow the economy by making investing more expensive. All right, the third tool is the required reserve ratio. So the required reserve ratio refers to the percent of one's bank deposit that the bank, and by we mean the bank, we mean a commercial bank, must set aside and not loan out. There is a multiplier associated with the required reserve ratio, and the formula is simply 1 over the required reserve ratio. This means that the smaller the required reserve ratio, the larger the multiplier. This makes sense because if the required reserve ratio is very low, then the commercial banks can use a larger portion of deposits to make loans and thus put more and more money into the economy. So, in conclusion, raising the required reserve ratio is contractionary, while lowering the required reserve ratio is expansionary. It's a tool because it's quite disruptive to the commercial banks, and it can have huge and less predictable cascading economics effects long term. Okay, for this unit, you need to understand two graphs, the loanable funds graph and the money market graph. Starting with the loanable funds market graph, it looks like a standard supply and demand graph. The quantity of loanable funds goes on the x-axis, and real interest rate goes on the y-axis. When you are labeling supply and demand, make sure to put the subscript LF for loanable funds. When you are labeling the equilibrium points, label the x-coordinate with Q for quantity and the y-coordinate with I or R for interest rate. Anyways, you really need to remember that the real interest rate is what goes on the y-axis, so a good way to remember this is real interest rates are really, really fun. A general increase in savings in an economy will entail a supply of loanable funds shift right, which decreases real interest rates as there is now lots of money to lend out. Basic supply and demand. Same and vice versa. Less money saved means a supply shift left and higher interest rates as there is now less money to lend out. All right, so now let's graph our monetary policy actions on this graph. So if the Fed buys bonds in an act of expansionary monetary policy, the supply of loanable funds increases, which lowers the real interest rate. Now, if the government sells bonds in an act of contractionary monetary policy, the supply of loanable funds decreases, which raises the real interest rate. One other thing I wanted to show the graph of is crowding out. So crowding out refers to when the government practices expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy entails deficit spending, meaning the government spends more money than it receives with taxes. To fund this deficit, because remember the government can't just spend money it doesn't have, the government must borrow large sums of money, which translates to an increase in the demand for loanable funds on our graph. As you can see, the new equilibrium interest rate is higher. The higher interest rate discourages spending and investing, which counteracts the intent of expansionary fiscal policy. And that's why crowding out is seen as a bad thing. All right, moving on, we have the money market graph. Okay, so the x-axis should be labeled quantity of currency, and the y-axis should be labeled nominal interest rate. Remember, this one is nominal, not real. And you can remember this with our funny little mnemonic device. Buy nom-noms with money at the market. Your demand line should shift downwards and be labeled MD for money demanded. But your supply line needs to be vertical because the money supply is a fixed amount controlled by the Fed. If the Fed buys bonds, remember, buy bonds, bigger bucks. Expansionary monetary policy will entail lower interest rates to encourage spending. When the Fed buys bonds, it gives money to the people, which is an increase in the money supply. Thus, our supply line moves right. As you can see, the new equilibrium nominal interest rate is lower. And now, if the Fed sells bonds, remember, sell bonds, smaller bucks. Contractionary monetary policy will entail higher interest rates, which will discourage spending and investing. When the Fed sells bonds, it takes monies from the people, which decreases the money supply. Thus, the supply line shifts left. As you can see, at the new equilibrium, the nominal interest rate is higher. A little tidbit I wanted to throw in there was the theory of the neutrality of money. So the theory goes, the Fed's monetary policy actions only affect nominal variables in the economy, such as prices, wages, and exchange rates, with no effect on real variables like employment, real GDP, and real consumption. So, in more basic terms, the theory is saying that monetary policy won't directly lead to real economic growth. It is only short-term effects. All right, thank you for listening. Hope you learned something. Yas, eat lasagna.